The night they asked me to leave my own son's school, I was standing directly beneath a portrait of the man who had saved it. He was painted in oils, life-size, in a dark suit, with the small, crooked smile I had kissed 10,000 times. He'd been dead 4 years, and not one of the beautifully dressed people pointing me politely toward the exit had the faintest idea that the quiet woman in the cheap dress they were shooing out of the gala was married to the man on the wall, or that his name was the reason the marble under their expensive shoes still belonged to the school at all. My name is June Alvarez. I clean houses for a living. My son Mateo was 14 that year, a scholarship student at Ashford Preparatory Academy, and I would have walked through fire for him. What I actually walked through was worse. I walked through an entire evening of well-mannered cruelty, and I said almost nothing, and I let them think I was nobody. Until a man stood up at a microphone and said a name that changed the temperature of the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning of that night and tell you why I let them do it to me for as long as I did. I need you to understand 2 things about me, and they seem to contradict each other, but they don't. The first is that I really do clean houses. That's not a metaphor. 3 or 4 days a week, I put on my knees on other people's floors, and I make their homes beautiful. And I am not ashamed of a single hour of it. My mother did the same work. There is a dignity in it that people who've never done it will never understand. The second thing is that I am, and have been for 4 years, the sole trustee of a foundation with more money in it than most of the families at Ashford will see in 3 generations. Both of those things are true. And the reason they can both be true is a man named Daniel. Daniel Alvarez grew up with nothing, the way I did. Worse, honestly. But he was one of those rare people who could see numbers move before they moved, who understood money like it was a language he'd been born speaking. I met him when we were both 22, both broke, both working nights, him at a loading dock, me at a diner near the bus depot. He used to come in at the end of his shift, order the cheapest thing on the menu, a cup of coffee and a single egg, and make it last 2 hours while he read library books about finance under the fluorescent lights. I noticed him because he always cleaned his own table before he left, and tipped more than he could afford, and said thank you like he meant it. One night, I sat down across from him on my break and said, You can't learn to be rich from a library book." And he looked up at me, dead serious, and said, "No, but you can learn not to be poor. And then, if you're careful and you don't forget where you came from, maybe you can make it so a few other people don't have to be poor either." 22 years old, eating 1 egg, and already the whole shape of the man was there. I married him 14 months later in a courthouse, in a dress that cost nothing. And I would not trade those broke years for anything the rich ones later bought us. That's the man they were insulting when they insulted my son. A man who cleaned his own table and tipped what he couldn't afford and built a fortune for the single purpose of quietly lifting up the kind of kid he'd been. The Vanessas of Ashford would have looked straight through the 22-year-old Daniel eating his egg. And that boy grew up to keep the lights on over all their children. Life has a long memory when you let it. Longer than any Gala. He built something. Quietly, over 30 years, he built something enormous. And he never once let it change how he treated a waiter or a janitor or a scholarship kid, because he never forgot being one. Ashford Prep gave Daniel a scholarship when he was 13. It changed the direction of his entire life, and Daniel never forgot it. So when he had the means, he created a foundation, the Alvarez Foundation. And he arranged for it to quietly fund a huge share of Ashford's scholarships and keep its endowment alive, on one absolute condition: that it be anonymous. He didn't want a building with his name on it. He didn't want a plaque. He wanted the money to reach the kids who needed it, without any child ever feeling like they owed a face. Charity that has a name on it isn't really a gift, June, he told me once. It's a leash. I want you to understand where that came from, because it wasn't an abstract principle for Daniel. It was a scar. When Daniel was 13 and Ashford gave him his scholarship, the man who funded it, a wealthy alumnus, well-meaning in the worst way, used to have Daniel brought out at donor luncheons. Stood up. Introduced as our scholarship boy, our little success story. Made to shake hands and be grateful in front of rooms full of people in good suits who wanted to feel good about themselves. Daniel told me, 40 years later, that he could still feel the specific heat of those luncheons on his face. The way gratitude, when it's demanded and performed, stops being gratitude and becomes the tax you pay for the crime of having needed help. They never once let me forget I was a charity, he said. Every kindness came with a little hook in it. And I swore, June, that if I ever had money, no kid would ever feel that hook from me. They'd get the help, and they'd never see the hand. Because a child should be able to just be a child, not a mascot for someone else's generosity. That is why the foundation was anonymous. It wasn't modesty. It was the most deliberate act of love I have ever known. A man reaching back 40 years to protect a boy he used to be, and every boy and girl like him, from the exact humiliation he'd endured. Every scholarship Ashford gave was Daniel cutting a hook out of a child's back before they ever felt it go in. He funded nearly half of them, anonymously, for 14 years. And the people who ran the school's social order had turned right around and grown their own hooks anyway, and were sinking them into my son. Daniel would have burned the building down. I nearly did. When Daniel died, the foundation passed to me. I became its sole trustee. Every year, I decide, quietly, through the lawyers, invisible, whether to renew Ashford's funding. I have renewed it every year because Daniel loved that school. And because our son went there, on a scholarship. And no one at Ashford knew that the scholarship kid's mother was the one signing the checks that kept their whole world afloat. I kept the secret out of grief and out of pride. And I'll admit it now, out of a small, stubborn desire to see who these people really were when they thought I was only the help. That night at the gala, I got my answer. Ashford threw its endowment gala every autumn in the grand hall, a soaring room with marble columns and oil portraits of old headmasters, and in the place of honor, near the entrance, a portrait of the school's most transformative benefactor. Unnamed, of course. Just a plaque that read, "A friend of Ashford." It was Daniel. I had chosen the portrait myself. I had wept in front of it more than once, alone, after hours. When I came to clean the offices of the very families who looked down on my son. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because it's the strangest, truest thing in this whole story. 3 nights a week, after the school emptied out, I cleaned those offices. Mine was one of the cleaning contracts I kept, not because I needed that particular one, but because it let me be near the place Daniel loved, in the quiet, when no one was performing. I would push my cart down those grand halls at 9 at night, past the trophy cases and the framed photographs of donors, and I would stop every time in front of Daniel's portrait, a friend of Ashford. And I would stand there in my cleaning smock with my cart. The woman the daytime families called the help, looking up at my husband, the man who had quietly kept the lights on over all their children's heads. And I would talk to him a little. I'd tell him how Mateo was doing. I'd tell him I missed him. Sometimes I'd cry. And then I'd wipe my face and finish my rounds. Because the offices don't clean themselves, and grief doesn't excuse you from the work. There's a particular kind of solitude in cleaning the offices of people who would never think to learn your name. In a building your dead husband paid for, in front of a portrait only you know the truth of. I carried that solitude for 4 years, and I never once, in all those late nights, felt tempted to tell them. Because Daniel had taught me that the truth doesn't need an audience to be true. My knowing was enough. His portrait knew. That was enough. Right up until the night it wasn't. The night they went after my son, and the enoughness broke, and the truth decided all on its own that it was finally time to be loud. The gala was the kind of event where the dresses cost more than my car. I came in the best thing I owned, a simple navy dress, 4 years old, that Daniel had once said made me look like the sky at dusk. I came because Mateo had begged me to. He was proud of his school. He wanted his mother there. What 14-year-old wouldn't? And I wanted to be there for him. So I put on my navy dress and my one good pair of shoes. And I walked into a room full of people I secretly, invisibly kept afloat. And I braced myself, because I already knew this crowd. Vanessa Crest found me within 10 minutes. She always did. Vanessa was the president of the Parents Association. And if you have ever known a woman who has decided that a school's social hierarchy is her personal kingdom, you have met Vanessa. She was polished to a shine. She had a smile she used like a scalpel. And she had appointed herself the guardian of who did and did not belong at Ashford. She glided up to me with 2 other mothers in her wake, and she said in a voice pitched to carry. "June, I'm so glad you came." Although, a little laugh, a little touch of my arm. "I have to ask, did you get the note from the office about the outstanding balance?" I'd hate for there to be any awkwardness. These events are really funded by the families who, contribute. There was no outstanding balance. Mateo's scholarship covered everything. I'd checked a dozen times, because a mother like me checks. It was a clerical error, or an invented one. But she said it loudly, and heads turned, and the meaning underneath the words was as clear as glass. You are a charity case, and you are embarrassing yourself by being here among your betters. "I'll follow up with the office," I said quietly. "Thank you, Vanessa." She beamed, victory sweet in her mouth, and moved on to work the room. And I stood there, with my face warm, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched. And I did what I had done my whole life. I stayed small. I stayed quiet. But this time, part of it was strategy, because I could feel something coming. It got worse before it got better. It always does. Over the next hour, the message spread the way these messages do, through glances, through little clusters of laughter, through the specific way a room can make one person into an outsider without ever raising its voice. The board treasurer, a florid man named Pemberton, made a point of mentioning, near me, how generous the real families were to subsidize students who couldn't otherwise dream of a place like Ashford. A couple of the fathers looked at my dress and looked away. I was, by the unspoken agreement of the room, the help who'd wandered in among the guests. And then Mateo came to find me. My beautiful boy, in a borrowed blazer, his hair combed the way he only combs it when he's trying. And I saw on his face that he'd heard some of it. Kids always hear. And it wasn't the first time, and that's what I could barely stand. A few weeks earlier, Mateo had come home quiet, the particular quiet that tells a mother something happened. And it had taken me 2 days to get it out of him. There'd been a class trip, and the teacher had asked everyone to bring spending money. And a boy named Preston Crest, Vanessa's son, had announced to a group of them that Mateo probably couldn't come because his mom cleans toilets. And the others had laughed. The easy laugh of children who've absorbed exactly what their parents think without ever being told it directly. Mateo hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted me to feel bad. He was 12 years old, protecting me from the knowledge that he was being made to pay, socially, for the work that fed us. He'd sat with that alone for 2 days rather than hurt me with it. That's the thing about the cruelty of comfortable people. It doesn't stay in the ballroom. It rides home in the back seat with your child. It gets into their idea of themselves. And I had lain awake more than one night in the years since Daniel died, wondering if I was doing right by my son, keeping him in a place that fed his mind and starved his sense of belonging, keeping a secret that could have ended every bit of it with one phone call to the lawyers. I told myself I was teaching him that dignity comes from inside, not from other people's approval. Most nights, I believed it. Some nights, watching him come home quiet, I wasn't sure at all. So now, at the gala, He came and stood next to me, close, protective. This 14-year-old trying to shield his mother, and he said, quietly, "Mom, we can go if you want. I don't care about this stupid party." And I heard all of it underneath. 2 years of a boy carrying something, so his mother wouldn't have to. That was the moment that nearly broke me. Not the insults to me. I've weathered worse than Vanessa Crest since I was younger than Mateo. But watching my son learn in real time that a room full of adults had decided he was less than because his mother cleaned floors and his father was a name on no building, that was the wound. That was the one I'll never forgive them for. Even now, even after everything. "We're not going anywhere, baby," I told him. "Go find your friends. I'm fine, I promise." He went, reluctantly, looking back twice. And I turned to face the room, and something in me went very still, and very cold, and very patient. And I decided that I would not leave 1 second before I chose to. That decision lasted about 20 minutes. Then Vanessa Crest came back to make sure I left. She brought the treasurer this time. Pemberton. Reinforcements. "June," she said. And now the sweetness was thinner, the scalpel closer to the surface, because the formal program was about to start, and she wanted the room cleaned of anyone who lowered the tone. "I don't want this to be uncomfortable, but the endowment program tonight is really for our contributing families and our board. Scholarship families weren't, well, they weren't really part of tonight's invitation, if we're being honest. It might be best if you slipped out before the speeches. I'm sure you understand. For Mateo's sake, too. You wouldn't want him to feel out of place." For Mateo's sake. She used my... That's the detail I want you to hold on to, because it's the detail that decided everything that came after. She looked at me, and she looked at my 4-year-old navy dress, and she told me to leave the celebration of the very money that paid for the room we were standing in. And she did it in my child's name. And here is the thing I am not proud of, and the thing I most need you to understand. I almost did it. I almost left. Because 44 years of being made small does something to you, and every instinct I had was screaming to protect Mateo from a scene, to gather my coat, to disappear, the way I'd spent a lifetime learning to disappear. "All right," I said. "I don't want any trouble. I'll go." Vanessa's smile bloomed, wide and satisfied. Pemberton nodded, pleased. And I turned to make my quiet exit, past the marble columns, toward the doors, which meant I had to walk past the portrait. I stopped in front of it. I couldn't help it. I never can. Daniel, in his dark suit, with his crooked smile, painted the year before he got sick. "A friend of Ashford," the little plaque said. I reached up, the way I always did when no one was looking, and I touched the bottom of the frame, just for a second, the way you'd touch a hand. And I heard, behind me, the headmaster's voice come up over the room. Dr. Ellery, tapping the microphone, beginning the formal program. "Good evening, everyone. If I could have your attention, Tonight is our endowment gala, and I want to talk to you, as I do every year, about the reason Ashford is still standing, still able to offer the scholarships that are and always have been the true heart of this school. I stood there, my hand on the frame of my dead husband's portrait, and I did not leave. Something rooted me to that marble floor. For 14 years, Dr. Ellery said, this school has been sustained by a single foundation, a benefactor who asked every year to remain completely anonymous, whose gifts have paid for nearly half of every scholarship we've ever given, who has, quietly, without a plaque, without thanks, without recognition of any kind, kept the doors of this school open. I felt the room's attention gather. I felt Vanessa, a few feet away, still glowing from having gotten rid of me, not yet understanding. This year, Dr. Ellery said, for the first time, I have been given permission, after long persuasion, to say the name aloud. Because I believe this community deserves to know, at last, who we owe everything to. And I turned around, slowly, my hand still on Daniel's frame. The foundation, Dr. Ellery said, is the Alvarez Foundation. It was created by a man who came to this school as a scholarship boy, with nothing, and never forgot it. His name was Daniel Alvarez. People glancing at each other. The name meant nothing to them yet. And its trustee, Dr. Ellery went on, and now his eyes found me across the room, standing beneath the portrait. And his voice changed, softened, cracked just slightly. Because Dr. Ellery, it turned out, was the one person at Ashford who had always known. Its trustee. The woman who has personally chosen to renew our funding every single year. The reason every scholarship child in this room has a seat is Daniel's widow. She's here tonight. She's standing right beneath his portrait. Her name is June Alvarez. I have thought a great deal since that night about the sound a room makes when a whole crowd's understanding of reality rearranges itself at once. It's not loud. That's the strange part. It's a kind of collective intake of breath. 100 small sounds, chairs shifting, heads turning, and then a silence deeper than the one before. Every face in that grand hall turned from Dr. Ellery to the portrait, and from the portrait to me, the woman in the cheap navy dress who had just been told, minutes earlier, that scholarship families weren't really invited. I watched it reach Vanessa Crest. I watched her face do the whole journey, the confusion, the disbelief, the frantic recalculation, and then the horror as it landed. She had spent an entire evening, and a great deal of it in front of witnesses, humiliating the sole trustee of the foundation that paid for the school her own children attended. She had told me to leave. She had used my son as a weapon. And she had done it all in front of the man on the wall. Pemberton, the treasurer, had gone the color of ash. And Mateo, my Mateo, came pushing through the crowd, his eyes enormous, and stopped and stared at me under his father's portrait. And I watched my son understand, all at once, who his parents actually were and who they'd chosen to be. That look on his face, I'll keep that one until I die. Dr. Ellery invited me to say a few words. My legs carried me to the front of the room, past all of them, and someone put a microphone in my hand. And I stood beneath Daniel's smile, and I looked out at the sea of faces that had spent the night deciding I was nothing. I did not scream. I had every right to. I chose not to. My husband came here with nothing, I said. And this school gave him a chance that changed his whole life. That's why he did all of this, anonymously, on purpose, because he never wanted a single child to feel like charity. He used to say that charity with a name on it is just a leash. I paused. He would have hated tonight. Not because of what was said to me. I can carry that. I've carried worse. He would have hated that in a room built by a scholarship boy's gift. The scholarship children were made to feel small. You could have heard a pin drop. Someone told me tonight that scholarship families weren't really invited, I went on, and I did not look at Vanessa, which was its own kind of mercy, and its own kind of blade. I want every scholarship family in this room to hear me. You are the heart of this school. You always were. My husband built all of this for you, not for the people who made you feel like you were borrowing a seat. For you. I paused, and I made myself look out at the whole room then, not just the scholarship families, but the Vanessas and the Pembertons and the fathers who had looked at my dress and looked away. And I found, to my own surprise, that I was not angry at them anymore. I was something sadder and steadier than angry. I am not going to pretend tonight did not happen, I said. It did. A woman told me, an hour ago, that people like me were not really invited. And I want to say to her, and to anyone who felt the same, I understand you better than you think. I know what it is to be so frightened of falling that you need someone below you to stand on. But I promise you, it does not work. There is no floor low enough to make you feel safe if the fear is on the inside. My husband knew that. He came from nothing, and he spent his whole life refusing to look down on anyone because he remembered how it felt to be looked down on. And he decided the remembering would make him kinder instead of crueler. That was the whole man. That is the only inheritance that ever mattered in my family. And it is the one thing in this room that money genuinely cannot buy. And then Pemberton, the treasurer. Poor, ashen Pemberton, who I think simply could not bear the weight of the moment, did the thing that turned a reckoning into a rout. Perhaps to change the subject, perhaps out of pure panic, he stood and began, stammering about the financial report, about the fees, about the outstanding balances the school was owed. And in his flailing, he said the sentence that undid Vanessa Crest completely. The only significantly overdue family account this year, he blurted, reading from. The report in his shaking hand, desperate to seem useful, is, well, the Crest family. 3 years in arrears. nearly $90,000. The room turned again, this time toward Vanessa, the woman who had spent all night implying I couldn't afford to be there. The woman who had lectured me, loudly, about contributing families. Her own family hadn't paid its tuition in 3 years. She had been drowning in her own unpaid debt, and she had chosen to make herself feel afloat by shoving the widow's head underwater. That is what cruelty so often is, I've come to believe. It's someone showing you exactly which wound they're most afraid of in themselves. Vanessa Crest left before the dessert. I did not watch her go. I was busy with my son. Because Mateo had made his way to me by then. Through the crowd, through all those turning faces. And he stood in front of me, under his father's portrait, with his eyes enormous. And he said, "Mom, is it true? Dad did all of this?" And I said, "Your dad did all of this, baby, for kids exactly like you. He just didn't want anyone to feel like they owed him for it." And my 14-year-old, who had spent 2 years carrying insults so I wouldn't have to feel them, looked up at the painted face of the father he'd lost at 10. And then he looked at me and he understood, all at once, that everything the world had spent the evening telling him about who he was had been a lie. That he wasn't borrowing a seat. His family had built the whole room. He didn't say anything else. He just took my hand, my grown-up boy, taking his mother's hand in front of everyone, not caring who saw. And we stood there together, under Daniel, the three of us, in a way, for one more moment. That is the image I keep from that whole night. Not Vanessa's face, not the reveal. My son's hand in mine, under his father's portrait, in a room that had finally run out of ways to make either of us small. Here is what I did, and I did it the way Daniel would have. I did not pull the funding. I know that's what a lot of people in the days after expected me to do, to withdraw the money, to let Ashford feel the loss, to punish them all for one bad night. I understand the appeal, but that would have punished the scholarship children most of all. And they had done nothing but be born to the wrong parents in the eyes of the wrong people. Instead, I renewed the funding, and I doubled it. On 3 conditions: put in writing, non-negotiable, signed in the headmaster's office the following week. The first, that Ashford establish a formal program to end the culture that made scholarship students feel like charity. Because a gift that humiliates the person who receives it is not a gift. It's a leash. And my husband spent his whole life cutting leashes. The second, that the number of full scholarships double in Daniel's name, now spoken aloud, because he was done being anonymous, and so was I. The third, and this was mine, not Daniel's, and I'll own it, that the Parents Association would be reorganized, and that its next president would be chosen by the scholarship families themselves. I understand Vanessa Crest resigned before she could be asked to. I did one more thing, quietly, that I've never told many people. I paid the Crest family's overdue tuition, anonymously, through the lawyers, the way Daniel would have. Not for Vanessa. I owed Vanessa nothing, and I want to be honest. that a mean little part of me enjoyed the idea of her never knowing. I did it for Preston, her son, the boy who'd inherited her cruelty and would now, if the debt collapsed the family, inherit her shame on top of it. He was a child. Whatever he'd said to Matteo, he'd learned it. He hadn't authored it. And I decided that the cycle of comfortable people teaching their children contempt could be broken just as easily by a working woman teaching hers grace. Daniel used to say, the measure of a gift is whether it has a hook in it. I made very sure that one didn't. Preston finished at Ashford. I hope, wherever he is, he turned out better than the kitchen table he came from. I gave him the chance to, at least. That's the most revenge I was ever willing to take. I refused to become the thing that had hurt my son. And I want to tell you what happened to the scholarship children of Ashford, because it's the part that matters most. The number of full scholarships didn't just double over the next few years. With the doubled funding and Daniel's name finally spoken aloud, it tripled. The program to end the culture of humiliation became a model that 2 other schools copied. And the children, the ones who'd been made to feel like charity, like they were borrowing their own education, walked those halls differently once they knew that the school's whole foundation had been laid by a boy who'd started exactly where they started. Belonging, it turns out, isn't something the comfortable people grant you. It's something the truth gives you, once somebody finally tells it. Matteo graduated from Ashford 3 years later, near the top of his class, unashamed of a single thing about where he came from. At his graduation, he gave a speech, and he talked about his father, the scholarship boy who built a foundation and asked for nothing, and about his mother who cleaned houses and kept a secret out of love. And there wasn't a dry eye in the grand hall. Right there, under the portrait, the same portrait, still hanging where it had, always hung, except now the little plaque beneath it had been changed. It no longer read, "A friend of Ashford." It read, "Daniel Alvarez, scholarship, class of long ago, who never forgot." I'd insisted on that. Daniel had wanted to be anonymous, to protect the children from the hook. But the children knew now, and knowing that a scholarship boy had grown up, to quietly carry half of them had done the opposite of shaming them. It had made them proud. 3 different scholarship kids told me, over those years, that they'd started standing a little taller once they knew whose gift they were standing on. So the anonymity had done its work. And then its work was done. And it was time for his name. Matteo's speech that day, I have it written down, I read it sometimes, ended with a line I think about constantly. He said, "My mother taught me that you find out who a person really is by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them." My father built a whole foundation on that idea and never signed his name to it. And a lot of people in this school found out one night, 3 years ago, which kind of person they'd been all along. I hope I'm the kind my parents were. I'm still working on it. But I know how to tell now. And that's the whole thing they gave me. There wasn't a person in that hall who didn't know exactly which night he meant. Vanessa Crest's son, Preston, the boy who'd once told a group of 12-year-olds that Matteo's mother cleaned toilets was in that graduating class too. I watched him during Mateo's speech. He couldn't look up. I felt something for him in that moment that surprised me. Not triumph, something closer to sorrow. Because Preston hadn't invented his cruelty. He'd inherited it at a kitchen table from a mother drowning in a debt she was too proud to name. And he was going to spend years unlearning it, if he was lucky, and forever carrying it if he wasn't. I still have that portrait. It hangs in my home now. A friend of Ashford, the old plaque used to say. Daniel would have laughed at that. He was never a friend of the institution. He was a friend of the kid in the borrowed blazer, the mother in the cheap dress, the person by the exit that everyone had decided was nobody. So was I. So am I. It's the family business, in a way. The night they asked me to leave my own son's school, I was standing directly beneath a portrait of the man who had saved it, and I let them think I was nothing. Right up until the moment the truth walked into the room on its own 2 feet, and everyone had to look at it. And I want to leave you with the thing I most learned that night. Not the sweet part, not the reveal, but the harder truth underneath it. The people who are quickest to tell you where you belong are almost always terrified about where they belong themselves. Vanessa Crest wasn't cruel because she was powerful. She was cruel because she was 3 years behind on the tuition and 1 bad month from losing the whole performance. The ones who need to make you small are the ones most frightened of their own size. So the next time someone points you toward the exit, in a cheap dress, in a room you supposedly don't belong in, I want you to remember my navy dress and my husband's crooked smile on the wall, and the fact that you never ever know who's quietly holding up the whole room. It might just be the woman they told to leave.